In this video, I will try to give you guys a very detailed archetype guide of the most popular decks out there right now, so you guys know what their key turns are and what you should be expecting from them as soon as you queue into the game. I will show you guys what are the most popular decks for each archetype, as well as their best performing exact deck, and we'll talk about what you should be thinking against each of them. So if you're serious about Hearthstone, drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget you can hire me for some Hearthstone coaching. Now, let's check out the decks.
You are not prepared!
If you guys want to check out what the best performing Hearthstone decks are right now, you can check out my latest top 5, and you can see exactly which decks you might want to be checking out. But here, we're looking more for the popularity aspect, and what you should be expecting when you actually face a certain class. So starting off with the popularity, in Diamond 1, which I think is a good sample size to really see what's going on, and you can see that Hound Hunter is actually the most popular deck out there, with almost 20% popularity. Pure Paladins are also pretty frequent, as well as Blood DKs. Thaddeus Druid is also out there a lot, as well as Control Priest, which really sucks. We can see a lot of Relic Demon Hunters out there, as well as Totem Shamans. Unholy Death Knight is also well represented, as well as Thross DK, and Rage Warrior as well. Undead Priest is also pretty frequent, Spooky Mage even, and the rest are going lower and lower. If we switch over to Legend, however, the situation is somewhat different, and you can see that Control Priest is actually a lot more popular there, which again, really sucks. The rest remain pretty much the same though, even though Outcast Demon Hunter definitely becomes a lot more represented, and you can start seeing some skilled rogues out there as well. Moving down to the popularity for archetypes, here we're gonna go over each individual archetype for each class that has more than 1% popularity and a decent win rate. For instance, we're not really gonna talk much about Control Mage, because even though it does have decent popularity, the win rate is just not there. Anyway, we're starting off with Death Knight, and we can see that Blood Death Knight, Unholy Death Knight, and Frost Death Knight are very well represented with decent win rates. Shocking, I know. Looking at Death Knight, here's one of the most popular lists out there right now, and it's worth noting when playing against Blood Death Knight, you should be expecting them not to be really doing too much in their first 4 turns. Obviously, they could develop some small minions, as well as equip a weapon, which can be considered a pretty decent high roll for them because it gives him so much control, but generally speaking, in the first 4 turns, you're free to go to develop a decent board. On turn 5, you obviously should be thinking about how you can play around things like Blood Boil, as well as Corpse Explosion, and you always gotta be keeping in mind how many corpses they actually have in their possession in order for you to determine what your best play would be. On turn 6, Hollow Hound and No Muncher become problems, and you gotta be thinking about your positioning at all times against Death Knights nowadays, because Hollow Hound is such a busted card, both for them as well as hunters. And if you really want to be positioning around this card, you gotta be playing your taunts on the far left and on the far right side, and you also want to have buffer small minions next to them, so that this guy can only cleave the taunt plus the small minion instead of your good free minions, for instance. You also gotta be considering things like Patchwork, and a lot of the popular lists also run Dirty Rats, even though this one does not have them. But in order to play around Patchwork, you might want to actually hold off on playing those useless 1-drops that really don't make a difference against these guys, in order for you to have a bigger chance of actually protecting your key minions. Obviously on turn 8, Soul Stealer becomes a problem, and you basically want to be baiting out their big removals, board after board, and you don't want to be overextending against these guys, so you can actually keep on refilling after each good removal they have. They're also running ETC, and what you should be expecting from them is usually Steam Cleaner, Teotar, and Lorfemar. Steam Cleaner right now is great against things like the Fizzle Snapshot, which is one of the main reasons why you want to be picking this, but it's also good against classes that actually pick Riven there, Horsemen, which also get destroyed by this. With Teotar, obviously they want to steal something from you, and with Lorfemar, they can make their minions insanely huge, like Hollow Hound becomes a 6/12 for instance. Moving down to Unholy Death Knight, and here it's a classical aggro matchup where the board really matters. In the early turns you're gonna want to put a lot of 1-drops against you, follow up with a good Battlefiend Necromancer. Plague Strike is a very huge way for them to not only remove something from your board, but also have a 2/2 minion that can also remove something else. The Hawkstrider Rancher is super powerful, and if you don't plan ahead on ways to actually deal with this early on, they could just tempo it out on turn 3 and follow up with a huge Nerubian Swarm Guard, and that is just something insanely hard to deal with this early. They also run things like School Teacher and Nerubian Viziers, and from School Teacher, they could be discovering things that buff the board, but they can also discover things that buff their hand, and again, buffing your Nerubian Swarm Guard like that can be insanely huge. Magaton nowadays draws a ton of cards for them. Sylvanas is something you need to consider, like if you play a very big minion on turn 6, Instead of going white, for instance, Sylvanas might be an excellent swing turn for them, so it's definitely something to think about. And if you actually manage to control the board long enough, the last problem you will be facing is Lord Marogar, which is another absolute huge swing turn for them, so be careful. So yeah, all around against these guys you need to be controlling the board, but also don't forget you also need to close the game at some point, because Lord Marogar is going to be a very huge question they're going to be asking you, and if you don't have a huge removal for that, or just a way to kill them that turn, this will be a very big problem for you. Moving down to Frost Death Knights, and here again it is considered an aggressive matchup, where they really try to be chipping damage in the early turns with their good early game minions. What you really need to be doing against these guys is protect your face as much as you can, and also play around the chain of freezes they're gonna be throwing at you as soon as turn 3 or 4 with Might of Menethil. A very important thing you need to be considering against these guys is not to board lock yourself, because if you actually fill the board with useless minions, and they start chaining Frostworm after Frostworm, you're basically gonna be watching them killing you across 2 turns. Key turns to be thinking about here would be on turn 3, Hardcore Cultist might be very annoying for you, so if you decided to go wide with some short minions with 2 health or less, this could be a huge problem for you. On turn 4, Pazik obviously is something to consider. And on turn 6, try not to be leaving an empty board, especially if the Frost Decay has 5 corpses, because Marrow Manipulator is going to be very painful. And on the other hand, Overseer Frigadar can also be 2 damage AoE, so that's also something to consider. The way you win against these guys is, like I said, you try not to take too much damage in their early turns, and they usually should not have enough damage later on, as long as you keep on contesting the board, and especially if you've actually managed to heal with things like Hollow Hound, for instance, because this deck has a limited amount of damage. They also have Astlore at the end, but usually turn 10 is not something you're gonna see too much with this deck nowadays. Moving now to Demon Hunters, and here we're starting off with Relic Demon Hunter. And right now this is one of the best performing Demon Hunters out there. And against these guys, in the early turns, they usually have a lot of removal, in the form of Relic of Extinction, Taste of Chaos, and they could even resort to using their Unleash Fel, especially if they've actually discovered an extra copy with Taste of Chaos. Setting up their location on turn 2 allows them to go for a turn 3 Relic of Phantasms, and they can also use it again on the turn where they get to use Relic of Dimensions, which is also super huge for them. They are running the minion Enchanter, which is super huge, and it does amplify the damage from all sources, including hero powers and minions, so leaving this alive basically means that your board is never going to be surviving anything. They could discover extra relics through Vizier as well as through their school teacher, and we all know that on turn 6 they are able to do a free damage AoE and basically heal back to full, especially if you've played useless small minions against them. This variant is also running Prosecutor Meltrinix, and she can be insanely powerful, especially if they combo it off with a 0 mana Relic of Phantasms, or she herself is 0 mana, so technically, if they plan their turn correctly, they can build a super huge board and lock yourself only to your far left and far right card, and that usually means you're not gonna have a way to deal with that board. They also have Xylag, and at the end they also have an Artificer Zymox, which is usually summoning them some very huge men. Against these guys, it's gonna be kinda tricky how you win, but you basically try to keep on pushing the pressure and try not to be giving them too amazing Unleash Fells. The other good Demon Hunter deck right now would be Outcast DH, and this is another typical very board-centric matchup. What these guys usually do is tempo out a lot of small stuff, and as soon as they actually stick those small things on the board, they get to follow up with Helveria, and if the minions on the board are actually rushers themselves, they start buffing themselves out of proportion. They can also combo off Helveria with Security, so they can buff up their other board that actually can go face. They have Wretched Exile, which gives them so much gas, and it's not very rare for them to chain Fierce Outriders over and over again for an obscene amount of stats. They can discover extra like those, or also extra Spectral Sights, which help them card draw a lot, and Glaivatar also helps them card draw a lot. Against these guys, basically how you win is you have to never let them have minions on the board, because if they do, with Helveria it just becomes very powerful very fast. And Hawkstrider Rancher also helps them stick those minions on the board, because it's gonna be very hard for you to actually deal with those over and over again. If they manage to play a bunch of Outcast cards early on, a Vengeful Walloper becomes something to really worry about, and they can also get some healing out of things like Felarin or Illidari Studies, in the form of I-Beams, for instance. When you see the rush of the stage, you should be worrying about them having Helveria in hand, and then you should really be trying not to leave them with minions on the board. But also don't forget that just chaining Glaivatars can be basically 16 damage to your face, so they don't really need to be having a board in order to do a decent amount of damage to you. Moving down to Druids, and here we have Thaddeus Druid as the only real archetype worth mentioning. And here the biggest high roll these guys could be making is a turn 2 Hedge Maze into a turn 3 Innervated Death Blossom, which can summon them a Thaddeus instantly. These guys usually have a hard time dealing with super aggressive decks, so if you manage to build a very good board early on, you should be able to close the game before they actually start doing some broken stuff. They have a Turniet Maw, which can silence your things, but they usually want to be using this for immune on their Mishmasher, and that way that's a full board clear. And they also have the Fanboy, which usually gives lifesteal, and again, giving that to the Mishmasher basically makes a full board clear as well as a full heal for the Druid. With the location, they could also abuse it with their Kolak, which can give them extra armor like that. They could also be using it straight up on their Flesh Behemoth, or they could even use it on their ETC, Rivendare, or Ozumat. And they also run Tony in there, which could be pretty good for you if you have played Jailer already. If the Druid actually plays a Death Blossom against you, if you have the means to actually deal with the Blossom and the minion that comes out of it, it might be worth actually doing that, because if you leave it on the board and they trigger it through Hedge Maze, they could just flood the board very fast, especially if they high roll with a Thaddeus out of it. Moving down to Hunter, it's worth noting we have both a 30 and a 40 variant out there right now, and we're gonna start off with the 30 variant, which is usually running secrets nowadays because they're just so good. Count Hunter is again a very board-centric matchup, and you definitely don't want to be falling behind on the board against them, because if they manage to actually chip you down nice and early, they could be finishing you off as soon as turn 6 or 7, depending if they have the coin, with a coined out Faithful King Crush. In terms of key turns here, you definitely should be worrying about the turn 7 Faithful Companion, on turn 6 the Hollow Hound, and on turn 10 the double King Crush, which can be huge. They also have Queen Ashara in here, and they usually are gonna be picking up the Colossal from this one, but they can also go for the Ring of Tides in order to actually repeat their last spell for 1 mana only. And the spell they usually repeat would be the Stranglethorn Heart, which is gonna be summoning a ton of King Crushes like that. They also have Astlor in here, which is pretty powerful, and also usually the secrets you should be playing around would be Wandering Monster as well as Hidden Meaning. But this only applies for the 30 variant, because in the 40 variant they are running zombies instead in order to actually have a better way to trigger their Nerubian Viziers, for instance. With the 40 variant, they're also running Lorfemar, and that really makes King Crush is a lot bigger, so if you see a Lorfemar, you need to start considering yourself dead even on 16 health just to a single Faithful Companion. And also another thing these guys are running is Sir Finley, so if you see these guys pulling off a Sir Finley, it usually means they're shuffling back their King Crush back into the deck so they can fish it out with the help of Faithful Companion. Moving down to Spooky Mage, and here this is a typical control deck that actually does have a lot of damage packed into it as well, but it's more of an OTK style deck, because what they try to do is they live long enough to build a bunch of Skeletals against you and finally pop them out with your Kel'Thuzad or with your Grand Magister Romath. They have a lot of ways to actually postpone the game with the help of Arcane Artificer, which gives them tons of armor. Obviously they have their solid alibis, they gain a lot of armor through cold cases, and they get to get extra copies of those powerful spells with Volume Up, for instance. They also have Queen Ashara, which they could be very creative with, and honestly all 4 options could be a pickup for them in this deck. They also run Star Power, Blizzard, Deathborn obviously, and like I said, on turn 8, if you have noticed that they've actually played too many skeletons already, Kel'Thuzad is definitely something to be considering. If you've noticed them having super many extra copies of key spells like Cold Cases, Deathborns, and Solid Alibis, you should definitely be considering a turn 9 Grandmaster Romath as well, but they can also play it a few turns later in order to load him up even more. For Mage we also have Burn Mage, which is a 30 list, and it's more of an aggressive archetype, which does go on the board, but their main win condition would be on turn 8 with their Arcane Bolts, which start dealing 1 extra damage on turn 8, and they've also had enough time usually to set up their spell power with Egwin, or even with the help of Vexalis, which can also be huge, but turn 8 would be the key turn that they are trying to live long enough for. Even if you think the game is going well, they can definitely chain a ton of solid alibis over and over again, with the help of Volume Up, for instance, or with the Commander Sivara, and you should definitely be very wary about their Deathborn potentials, because those skeletons are no joke. When you're playing against a 30 mage, and you suspect them to be Burn, you might want to be considering ways to actually steal Egwin with things like Sylvanas or silence them somehow. or something along the lines, because without Egwin it becomes definitely a bit harder for them, but like I said, not impossible because Vixalis is also quite the huge minion for them. And with his help, suddenly 3 arcane bolts become 18 damage out of nowhere. They also chain their frozen touches over and over again, and they keep on giving you small minions so they can reload the touch again with the infuse, and they also have a couple of locations obviously. Moving down to Pure Paladin, this is another classic, very aggressive board-centric matchup, and against these guys in the early turns you're obviously supposed to be expecting their small dudes, their weapon, which can buff something really big. On turn 6 their key cards would be Horn of the Windlord, as well as the Purator, which can give them 0 mana light rays. As soon as you see the Purator, you should know for a fact they are gonna have access to their Anachronos, and that is something to really worry about. And in some cases they actually play Anachronos with both their light rays on that turn, and suddenly the board is entirely in their favor. So you need to be thinking in advance how you could be dealing with something like that on turn 7 that way. The Countess is also very powerful, and they also have Leviathan, which is a good removal tool that refills them. The way you win against these guys is you try to win the board basically. It's not so much a face race as it is dominate on the board kind of deal, but definitely don't feel too happy about playing single target very tall minions, because they can just cut them down to size with the class action Lawyer. And they also obviously have access to huge healing with Feast and Famine comboed with Horn of Windlord, as well as Fork Out the Loss. Moving down to Control Priest, which is everyone's favorite matchup to face obviously, and here you need to be thinking against a lot of things, like Control Priest is one of the matchups where you really need to push it to the max in order to maximize your odds, but nowadays the traditional removal these guys are running would be the 4 mana Cannibalize, 4 mana Shadow Word Ruin, the 5 mana Clean the Scene, which can also get infused up to 6 attack or less, and also Harmonic Pop, as well as Whirlpool. So these would be key turns for you to be thinking about these key removals. You should also be thinking about the Blackwater Behemoth, and if you actually have ways to kill the opponent from your hand without having to use the board, you might even consider not playing a minion around turn 7 or 8, just so you deny them the initial healing from the Blackwater Behemoth, because it only auto-attacks minions once it's on the board. A new nasty tool they did receive would be Power Word Chord, and they can be very creative in the way how they use this. They could use it just on their small minions early on to make them very trade efficient, or they could use it for extra Astalors, extra Dirty Rats, extra Mind Eaters, but most importantly extra Behemoths, which is just downright annoying. Against these guys, again, try to build boards after boards, but not overcommitting too hard, so you can actually keep on refilling while they keep on removing, and you just hope that their removal ends before your refills end. Up next is Undead Priest, and here it's a bit more simple. This is again a very aggressive board-centric matchup, and usually these guys early on are trying to build sticky, annoying small boards, which are very hard to deal with the help of things like Undying Ally, Foul Leg, and Banshee. If you actually manage to deny these guys early game, they're gonna have a very hard time finishing you off, because late game they don't really have too many ways to stick great boards. So usually their game plan would be up until turn 4 or 5 to just try and chip you down with good early game boards, and after that try to finish you from hand with the help of things like Rotting Necromancer, Shadow Word Undeath, Mindseer, and their hero powers straight up. Some lists also run the 2 damage Boneflingers instead of Amalgams, and also you need to be worrying about High Cultist, especially if you see them building a very annoying Death Rattle board with the helps of Shadow Spirit, Foul Leg, Banshee, and things like that. Like, those would be key cards for you to actually worry about getting revived with the Basilisk. So yeah, against these guys, again, you try to control the board as much as you can and trade most of their stuff, but also if you have access to some healing, that really helps, because their damage is, again, potentially limited. Moving down to something that's not super popular, but Secret Rogue is definitely something to be thinking about nowadays. And this is not honestly a matchup I've faced too much of, but some things worth noting is the Ghastly Gravedigger, which could be extremely annoying, because they get to thin out your hand over and over again with the Shadow Step. So if you see a Ghastly Gravedigger on the board, you might as well kill it off before they get access to their Shadow Steps, because doing this over and over against you is gonna get you out of resources very fast. They're obviously also running the good Concoction package. And nowadays Rogue also actually has access to Deafen, which is a great silence for only 1 mana, and the Breakdance can also be pretty annoying. They do run Queen Ashara usually for an extra Colossal, and they also have their Krakatoa. The secrets you should be playing around usually would be Perjury, which you can't really play around much. They also have Sticky Situation and Double Cross, so in some cases it might be worth not spending all of your mana, especially if you see that the rogue is low on cards. We also have Miracle Rogue out there still doing somewhat well, and again they do run the classic Concoction package. They have their 2 locations, and they can still definitely be building very tall targets through this. But other ways they can win the game against you would be with Queen Ashara and Shadow Stepping her a few times for extra huge Colossals, as well as their potion package can be extremely annoying as well. How do you win against these? Well, it's a good idea not to leave their Ghoulish Alchemists alive, as well as their Concoctors, because they do like Shadow Stepping those for a lot of value, and also figuring out ways to actually deal with the graveyards before you actually have to deal with those would be very beneficial for you as well. So if you have access to some Discovers, you're definitely looking for some single target big removals. Astalor getting Shadow Stepped a bunch of times is also a pretty solid win condition for both of these rogue decks, so be careful leaving Astalor on the board as well. Moving down with Shamans, and here we have Totem Shaman, which is again another very board-centric matchup, and as long as you don't leave these guys with good boards, you should be fine. But don't forget they can actually vomit out an obscene amount of stats for a very low amount of mana, and they can literally fill the board for as little as 3 mana if they have an Anchor Totem comboed off with Infused Totemic Evidence. Leaving boards against you with these guys is definitely a big no-no because they can do things like Rotgill on them, and there's also plenty of lists out there that are running Bloodlust in their lists, which makes 0 totems suddenly very dangerous. So again, the name of the game against these guys is win the board, win the game. But also don't forget they also have access to Gigant Totems, so even though if you kill the small things, if you don't have ways to deal with this at some point, that might also be a problem. And also Horn of the Windlord is something to think about on turn 6 from them. We also have Evolve Shaman doing pretty well and being pretty popular right now, and it's very similar to what the Totem Shaman is doing. And again, you kinda wanna be removing the minions these guys are playing, especially if they've actually cheated them out for cheap, because they could evolve those cheap things into something a lot bigger. Like, let's say 0 mana things from below could get evolved easily into an 8-drop with the help of Convincing Disguise, and so on and so forth. You definitely wanna be killing Baroness Vash if you have ways to do that. And again, they do have the weapon against you, so keep that in mind. Moving down to Thaddeus Warlock, which has actually adopted the Curse package into it. And against these guys, their key turns would be usually turn 5, where they get to play their Amorphous Slime. Problem with these guys is they have an obscene amount of early game removals, with the help of things like Defile, Drain Soul, Drag Below. So you definitely want to be playing around things like Defile early on, especially if you have a very wide, small board. Nowadays, Shallow Grave is actually a staple card for these guys, so if you actually leave the 5 mana Amorphous Slime alive, you might be in for a very brutal awakening. But the problem with these guys is, it's a very high rolly, but also very clunky deck, so you never really know if doing what you're doing is actually the correct line, because it all comes down to what they actually have in their hand. If you do kill the Amorphous Slime and whatever comes out of it, which is usually a Thaddeus, they could just instantly revive it with the 5 mana Reanimator, and that can be extremely annoying. It could also pull out their Draftier, which is also extremely strong, and you do need to deal with it early. And nowadays these guys are also running the Shadowborn, and if you see this getting played against you, you gotta know you're gonna be seeing a faster Abyssal Wave very soon. For your Curse package, you're usually fine ignoring it for a while, but after it starts becoming above 4-5 damage, you probably need to start playing those, because they can definitely chain a lot of damage, with things like Lady Darkvein, let's say, and also if you ignore those curses, you could be expecting a Zakul, which is gonna be healing them for a lot. They're also running the 5 mana Symphony, and you should usually expect them to have weapon removal too, but that's a tech card, so it's anyone's guess. There's also an imp variant of a Thaddeus Warlock right now, which is also doing pretty okay, even though the win rate is not super amazing. And here, again, they are running the Thaddeus package with Amorphous Slime, as well as the legendary Draftier and the Flesh Behemoth. And they also have Symphony of Sins, but the rest is board-centric Imp Warlock, so you also will need to be controlling the board early and hope they don't have the huge high roll with Thaddeus. And moving down to Warrior, we have Enraged Warrior doing pretty well right now. And against these guys, you really need to have a way to deal with Anima Extractor early on, because if you leave this sticking on the board for a while, you're gonna have to start dealing with very tall targets, which usually actually have charge too. You really can't be leaving things like Anima Extractor alive on the board, as well as Sunfury Champions, because those can also be extremely powerful for them. And you also should remember, on turn 3 they do have access to the Imbued Axe, so if you actually leave a damaged minion on the board, it can become a lot bigger of a problem than you initially thought. They also have Tori Belor, Core, which they could repeatedly summon over and over again with the help of their fire spells, and on turn 5 you should be expecting a Bridge Rift, which could get repeated as long as they chain another Rift soon. On turn 6 Olgra is the big minion that can go to your face, on turn 7 Remornia is the big minion that can go to your face, and on turn 8 that would be Growmash. Especially if they have a location on the board, Growmash can be a huge problem for you. The way you win against these guys usually would be, again, by controlling the board nicely. And you also might need to be thinking about having big removals against them, because they could be getting pretty big minions with the help of Jam Session, or with the help of Chorus Rift, or in general just by having big minions against you. And lastly, we also have Manage Area Warrior, and this is a very straightforward board-centric deck, which tries to be playing a lot of different tribes in order to buff up their other minions. The free mana Power Slider is the first big minion you should be worrying about, especially if you have seen already a bunch of cheap tribes against you, and it does also have Rush, so that could be a problem. If you see Rockmaster Voon copying the opponent's hand, you should be expecting them to be copying their Amalgam Band, and the Amalgam Band is extremely powerful as well, because it usually has Rush, Divine Shield, Wind Fury, Poison, and Lifesteal, and that's basically clearing the board while getting him back to full, which is why this was a very hard matchup for things like Frost DK back in the day. They are also running Nellian here, and Magata gives them a lot of card draw. With the help of Party Manimal, they get to buff out their things, and if you actually see them using their Amalgam on the Razorfan Rockstar, you should be assuming they got lucky with the Amalgam Band, because the Quillbores in Standard right now are not that many. Alright, all around that's it for this video. It definitely became very longer than I have firstly anticipated, but I hope this helps you better understand what you're facing each matchup and how you should be approaching it. Thanks for watching, I'm Kris05, and I'll see you in my next video or stream.